Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, a Russian history podcast for normal people. As always, I'm your host, Kyle. And today, I have a topic that I think everyone's going to know a little bit about. I would hope so anyways, because we're talking about vodka. And if you're listening to this and you don't know what vodka is or how it's connected to Russia, then I am absolutely floored. Whatever rock it is that you were living under must be in one hell of a cave at the bottom of the ocean. Because if you hear vodka and don't think Russia, or vice versa, I don't know what you're on, man, but that's pretty powerful stuff. Because vodka at this point is more or less kind of institutional to, at the very least, the American, but also the Western, really the worldly understanding of Russia. And part of that is fair, and part of that is unfair. And I'll basically just get into that real quick, which is that vodka is a very central part to a lot of kind of Russian tradition, Russian culture, and alcohol in general is very central to a lot of Russian tradition and Russian culture, and alcoholism is a big issue within really all iterations of Russia, like from the very beginning up until this very day. But where it's kind of not fair is that a lot of people will kind of point the finger at the Russians and go, well, they're all just a bunch of drunk weirdos and they all suck because they're a bunch of drunk lechers. And well, no, that's not really the case. Alcoholism is an issue within the Russian Federation and within a lot of ex-Soviet states. But to say, well, they're inherently drunk, lecherous, whatever, it's not really fair to say that. There's a lot of issues with alcohol all over the planet, but we can have a little bit more of a nuanced discussion of the history of alcohol within Russia, which is exactly what I intend to do here. Because alcohol, and particularly vodka, like I said, and like you probably already know, is a very central part to our conception of Russia. And some of this is on purpose. The Russians are proud of vodka because it is something that they see as Russian. And, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We'll get into that just a smidge here in a second, but for the kind of sake of argument, the Russians see it as being a Russian thing. It's something that they are proud of. It is something that they bring to the table that is known far and wide as being Russian. And it's something that brings a lot of pride and also brings a good chunk of change to Russia and has brought money and pride and notoriety, I guess, to Russia in all of its forms for a long time. So it is very central to Russia, but also at the same time, it is something that we kind of have imposed on the Russians because I'm going to talk here at the end about like Russian drinking culture, just because I think it's interesting. And if we're going to talk about Russia and vodka, we should at least, get into the specifics of it. But it's really not that different or radically crazy compared to any other drinking culture. I have been to parties in the US of A, and I've been to parties in Russia. And there are certain kind of key differences, particularly in how drinking is done, but they are both very alcoholic events. And so to say that the Russians are somehow kind of like different, really, in broad terms, absolutely not. In kind of minor terms, little minute details, sure, absolutely. But realistically, the kind of alcohol thing, it's a big deal in a lot of places. It's a big deal everywhere. So to argue that it is a uniquely Russian thing is kind of silly. So let's go ahead and I'll get off my soapbox and we can get right into the history of vodka. As I said, vodka is, if not one of the most recognizable Russian things out there. I mean, maybe the only other thing more recognizable to particularly a Western audience than vodka, maybe the AK-47? Communism? I don't know. It would be pretty hard to tell, and at the very least, vodka and the AK-47 are at least actually from Russia, whereas of course communism isn't. And we'll do a whole episode on communism later, but it is kind of inextricable, that being communism and Russia. It's really hard to kind of pull the two apart at this point because of, well, how instrumental the Soviet Union was in all of the communism that's happened basically in most of the history of communism. But I digress. Vodka's a really, really big thing in Russia, and is a really, really big thing in how we view Russia. But is vodka Russian? Well, that's that's a bit of a hot topic. Well, depends. Are you Polish or are you Russian? Because if you're Polish, of course it's Polish. If you're Russian, well, of course it's Russian. And really, I'm not going to weigh in on this. We don't really 100% know. There are people on both sides of this argument that will point to even older and older manuscripts saying, well, here's proof or whatever. But realistically, we can tell that vodka came about in the 8th or 9th century, so 800s in Eastern Europe. Where exactly is kind of hard to tell, and to be perfectly honest, I don't know, it doesn't really bother me a whole lot. I don't put a whole lot of stock in this because Russia and Poland didn't really exist at that time. Sure, there's kind of the pre-Polish, pre-Russian states that they can trace their roots back to, but these places didn't really exist at the time. And at this time, the cultures that exist in that space are quite a bit different than the cultures that exist now. So, whichever one you like, I think is perfectly fine. But it is important to note that there is somewhat of a debate that is going on, and that debate is kind of maybe unknowable. Who knows? I guess until we find some real definitive proof, it's kind of just going to be up there, floating around in the air for people to pick and choose. But one thing to remember is that at this time, the 8th, 9th century, this isn't really the vodka that we understand today. I mean, there's no Stolies floating around for people to go pick up at the grocery store. Rather, vodka is being made in a very, very different way and is really kind of, in a certain degree, completely not recognizable compared to today's current vodka. And kind of the neat thing about vodka back then is vodka wasn't originally distilled. Rather, they would kind of just leave some wheat outside, particularly during the winter, and let it do its thing. And the water that was in there would freeze and would float to the top of the alcohol. So you could just skim that off and bada boom, bada bing. You got some bread poison right there that you can get drunk off your ass on. And so, yeah, that's quite a bit different than the way we make vodka now. I don't know a whole lot about the way we make vodka now, but that is definitely a old world way of doing so. I don't imagine in this day and age there's a lot of people just leaving buckets of bread out on their porch to see if they can get drunk off of it. But from basically the very beginning, vodka is kind of an important thing, and it starts to take on somewhat of a character of its own. And a little bit of kind of an interesting thing is at this time, there is no name for vodka. And there wouldn't really be a solid nailed down name for vodka, well, that being the name, of course, vodka, until about the 1750s, when the Empress Elizabeth starts trying to control who has the rights to produce vodka. At the times before that, it was known by a couple of things. My favorites are bread wine, and my absolute favorite is burning wine. And the reason I particularly like that is because in Russian it is горячее вино, which means like hot wine. You know, burning wine. I don't know. I just think that that's fun. But so at that time, like I was saying, is vodka was already kind of part of the culture and was kind of taking on a culture of its own. In particular, it was being used for medicine. This was, in a lot of ways, a medicinal product. Of course, people understood you could drink it and get drunk, but they also understood that, one, water can kind of just kill you dead, so sometimes it's good to drink something that is not water, or you can use it to disinfect things, because while people don't 100% understand things like modern medicine, modern germs, germ theory is like 1,000 years off at this point in the 800s, but they do understand that, hey, drinking dirty water will kill you. Putting a little bit of this stuff in there makes it less likely for you to die. Or they also understand that, hey, if you have a wound, maybe putting a little bit of this on it makes you less likely to die. The other thing they would use it for is to numb you. Hey, you're injured. Why don't you have a couple shots of vodka, and maybe you're not going to be so, oh my god, I'm dying anymore. Maybe things will feel a little bit better. The only kind of issue with that, though, is, of course, alcohol is a blood thinner. And if you have a big gaping wound that they're like, oh man, yeah, hurts, have some vodka, you might bleed a little bit more. But then again, this is the 800s we're talking about, and so we're still very much so in the medical world of ghosts living in your blood and you gotta get them out. So, go figure. It's a doctor. You can take what you can get at the time. And this established vodka as a part of Russian culture. It is now not just a thing to drink to get drunk, but also has a certain amount of utility to it. And it would continue to have some amount of utility for as long as we had kind of an outdated, outmoded sense of medicine. And one of the things that's particularly interesting is because, again, it is medical in a way, it's also social. People are drinking this to get drunk, to have parties, whatever. So there's quite a bit of usage of this. There's quite a bit of consumption. And the government says, hey, that's some good money that we can get in on. So like I said, the term vodka shows up in the year 1751. That's the first time it's recorded anyways. I imagine it was used before then, but that's the first time we know of it being written down. And that's when the Empress Elizabeth started creating regulations on the ownership of vodka distilleries. So it might come as a big surprise, but in a country where the average person wasn't allowed to own land and was owned as basically a slave, only the aristocracy could own a vodka distillery. Only people who were very wealthy. And that's basically how it would be from the 1700s up until the 1900s, when there were some issues with the quality of the vodka. And this is a bit of a big deal, because remember, this isn't just, oh man, this is booze to get drunk on. There's certain medicinal properties that are being used here. And you might say, well, it's the 1900s. We already have germ theory. We're starting to understand medicine a little bit better, and you are correct. But also remember, Russia at this time is like 1/6 of the world's landmass. And so you have everything from Central European, more cosmopolitan, large-scale cities that have been connected to scientific changes all across the world for hundreds of years, to villages in Siberia so far away from nowhere you would get lost looking for them just on a map. So there's quite a bit of difference. And so a lot of people, even though there's better medical practices and better medical understanding, might not necessarily A, have access to those things, and B, might not necessarily be interested or believe in them. So vodka still has a certain degree of medicinal value. As well, it's alcohol, and if the quality of it is bad, it might not just be an issue of, oh, well, I'm not going to be able to get drunk, or this doesn't taste good. It could be poisonous, or, well, more poisonous, since alcohol is pretty much just a poison. So that is an issue. And while, of course, the Tsar doesn't actually really give a shit about any of these people, he doesn't want all of the serfs to die. That would be bad. Then who's going to go fight in the wars? Then who's going to go build him a new palace, or, whatever. So, in the year 1902, a Russian government monopoly was established on the production of vodka. And this monopoly on vodka actually still exists today, though it doesn't really work nearly as well as it once did. Back in the day, the Russian government made about 1/3 of all of its money on the sale of vodka. Today, the Russian Federation is quite a bit more open than, of course, say, the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. And also, vodka is much more out there now. There is vodka being produced in so many more places. Part of this, of course, is a lot of Russians fled from Russia, and they took that information with them. As well, of course, now that that stuff's out there, you have other people saying, hey, I want to make this stuff too. And so now, if you go to a grocery store in Russia, well, maybe not right now considering all the sanctions, but, assuming that there are no sanctions, let's say, in 2018, if you went to Russia, you would find American, French, German, whatever iterations of vodka for sale on the shelves of stores. So the Russian government today has quite a bit harder time of controlling this, because while they do still have a monopoly on the production of vodka within the Russian Federation, there are so many foreign copies that are coming in, and it's hard for them to, one, control all of that, and two, to compete with it, because they're competing now on a more open market, and having had vodkas from various different Russian distilleries and vodkas from various different non-Russian distilleries, it's vodka, man. It's kind of all the same. And so it's really hard to compete with that. But the Russian government is still trying. And a big reason why they're still trying is that throughout pretty much all of Russian history, vodka has been a present aspect in all aspects of society. It was then, and it still is now, super common for people to drink vodka more or less once a day with their dinner, if not more often, especially if this is a meal that is being had with a number of people. In Russian culture, it is generally considered a sign of an alcoholic to drink by yourself, whereas, say, in America, that's not that weird. But within Russia, if I was to, say, crack open a beer with my dinner that I'm eating all alone, that might be a little suspect. If I crack open 1 to 50 beers with my friends while we eat dinner, that's not so weird. And it's pretty common that, especially in a more social environment where you have a couple folks over, you're going to have vodka. And when you have vodka, you generally have a good amount of it. And a lot of this comes down to that Russian culture loves toasts. And it really is a fairly jovial culture. When I went to Russia in 2018, this was kind of one of the most interesting things to me, is that the average individual Russian that you walk up to on the street, they're not going to talk to you. They're not going to say hi to you. They're not interested in you. They're going to look right through you. Kind of like if you go to New York. These are not people who are really like, oh man, hi stranger, nice to meet you. No. They have better stuff to do. And there's quite a bit of culture of distrust within Russia and a lot of post-Soviet countries. And so the average individual Russian is not somebody who's going to, be your friend unless, say, something horrible is happening, like you've been shot. Like, sure, they will help you or whatever, but they're not really going to engage with you any more than what is kind of the most socially acceptable of, oh, thank you, no, just answering basic questions, or, of course, if they're some kind of service worker, how may I help you, whatever. But on the inside, kind of in the inner circle within these people's lives, Russian society is very jovial. They like parties, they like big get-togethers, they like having people over, and when they have people over, they really like to eat and drink, and this drinking is absolutely central to the experience. In the course of a meal, because that's generally what a lot of these kinds of get-togethers will focus around, it is common to have a number of glasses of alcohol on the table at any given time for each individual person. At the very least, you will generally have one glass for, say, wine, maybe a bottle of beer, something like that, and that's something you're going to sip on throughout the meal, and then you're going to have one shot glass to be filled and refilled as toasts come along. And this is where kind of hard alcohol and not so hard heavy alcohol come into their own spaces. Like I said, that first glass is generally for sipping. This could be champagne, this could be beer, this could be wine, something not so harsh. And this is going to be filled and refilled and sipped on basically the entire time. And when you run out, it just gets refilled. You or someone else pours more in. Now, this shot glass generally stays empty or is filled until a toast. You don't touch it until a toast. And these toasts are common. It would not be uncommon to have anywhere from 3 to 5 toasts in a standard meal. Now, when I say a standard meal, I mean this isn't every dinner, but this is, maybe once a week, sometimes more depending on your socioeconomic status, how many people you know, and of course just how socially out there you are. So, a note on toasts. As I said, toasts are common, and Russian toasts can be about just about anything, but they're generally fairly specific. I remember when I was in school and when I was going to Russia, I was told you don't just say, oh, a toast to like a concept, generally, not a toast to life or a toast to health so much. A little bit less l'chaim, a little bit more, here's to your health. Here's to your life. Here's to something a little bit more specific. During the times of communism, it wasn't uncommon for people to say, toast Joseph Stalin, to toast the state, to toast the success of the country or the success of, say, a mandated task. Now, of course, Russia is not a communist country, but people will still do toasts like this, particularly in kind of a joking, sarcastic way. I have seen people make toasts to all kinds of things that you might say, that's a little bit weird, but it's kind of tongue-in-cheek. A toast to, say, Vladimir Putin, or a toast to the Russian government, or whatever. And then, of course, a lot of this depends on who you're toasting with. But as a general rule, these toasts are generally for one another, people at the event, to friends, family, to those who are dead and being remembered, or to things that you or the folks around you want to see in the future. A toast to maybe a certain individual's success, maybe a toast to somebody's impending marriage, or maybe a toast to somebody's newborn child. These toasts could be about really anything, and these toasts are basically always, pretty much any time a new round of drinks is being served, particularly hard drinks, you are going to have a toast. And like I said before, you could have a number of toasts every night, which means in the course of a general kind of fairly standard meal where you might have guests over, you might have anywhere from 3 to 5 to 7, maybe even 10 shots of alcohol, of course, depending on a few things. One is how much money you have. Of course, alcohol in Russia is quite a bit cheaper than it is here, but it is still not free. How much you can tolerate alcohol, what kind of crowd you're with, whatever. But as a general rule, in my experience, 3 to 5 drinks is pretty normal. And then, of course, you also have your sipping cup, in which you are drinking, say, wine or maybe beer or champagne. But as a general rule, within your shot glass is vodka. Though, of course, that is not a guarantee because, well, not everybody likes vodka. And there are quite a few other strong alcohols that are fairly common and fairly popular within Russia. A lot of this boils down to, kind of in my experience, two things. There's a traditional Russian fixation, particularly Russian upper crust, on France. And then as well, there is a geographical closeness to the Caucasus. And as such, wine and champagne and cognac are fairly common occurrences. A note on this wine, it is particularly common to see the really sweet or semi-sweet wines that come out of Georgia, which are some of my favorite. I'm not a big alcohol guy, and I'm really not a big wine guy. But I do like me some sickly sweet wines. And there are some pretty good sweet wines that come out of Georgia. And within Russia, they are incredibly popular. They are really, really big. And if you ever go to, say, a Russian grocery store within the United States, I guarantee that you will find some Georgian wines in there. And you can always tell the Georgian wines because they come in these very cool jugs that oftentimes are really ornate and kind of look like fish or maybe have like a little scene on them. And they're made out of this kind of brownish pottery material. They're really, really cool. And the wine is really, really good. Of course, if you prefer sweet and semi-sweet wines like myself. But this is where things are going to take a little bit more of a serious turn. So we had a little bit of fun talking about alcohol and alcohol culture within Russia. And I still think that that is very important. I don't want this to be overshadowed by the kind of harsh reality that there is within Russia. I do think that this culture is important. I think it is not necessarily a bad culture, or really any worse than any other alcohol culture, which I also kind of hesitate sometimes to say whether that's good or bad. But it is a big part of the Russian culture, and I think that it needs to be understood and respected as much as any other culture and its usage of alcohol. But alcohol is a very big issue within Russia, particularly alcoholism, particularly amongst men who have a roughly decade shorter life expectancy than women. Alcohol is a massive issue. So just to show you that I am not making this up, women have a roughly 77-year life expectancy, which is about 3 years shorter than the average American woman's life expectancy. Russian men, on the other hand, have a 67-year life expectancy. That is 10 years less than Russian women and 7 years less than the average American man. This is nuts, especially considering that the US has a relatively shorter life expectancy than a lot of developed countries. And while it is absolutely true that Russia is not a developed country, at least not in the way that somewhere like the United States or a lot of Western European countries are, it still has quite a bit of progress that needs to be made on things like the economy, on things like access to medical care, that arguably keep it from the developed nation status. Though, to be fair, arguing kind of what is and what isn't a developed nation can kind of really turn into a little bit of kind of gross self-masturbatory exercise for a lot of Western countries. So I don't want to get too far into, is Russia a developed or developing country? It is definitely behind on a lot of Western European countries and the United States on certain aspects of its development, but it is also a fairly stable country. There is not a lot of conflict within Russia. The period of instability, particularly in the 90s and early 2000s, is more or less over. Crime is no longer nearly as rampant. Terrorism is not nearly the problem that it once was. And a lot of the large conflicts that plagued the Soviet Union are not happening now. Because while the war in Ukraine is absolutely going to, and is already, I imagine, having an effect on the life expectancy of Russians, particularly Russian men, it's nothing like the First World War, the Russian Civil War, the war in Afghanistan, and the war in, well, sorry, not the war in, the Second World War, particularly because these all happened within like 1 or 2 generations. And then even the wars in Chechnya and whatnot have come and gone. The past 20-ish years have been very stable for the Russian Federation. Only in the last couple have we seen kind of a return to not even necessarily instability, but conflict. And this conflict, of course, is something that drives life expectancies down because of the casualties incurred by that conflict, but as well because of the alcohol abuse that comes with those conflicts. And I know I've talked quite a bit about conflict, and conflict is a very big and important reason why alcoholism has been a very big thing in not just the Russian Federation, but also in the Soviet Union and before that. Even before the Soviet Union, there was quite a bit of war, like we were talking about in, say, the Pugachev episode, or in the episode about serfdom. People are being drafted into these conflicts that they don't want to be a part of, that they are being stuck in for decades, and this drives that alcoholism. But, like I said, we're going to put a pin in conflict, and then we're going to talk about kind of Russian society as well, and how that drives alcoholism as well. In particular, it's not so much, say, Russian society on the kind of individual to individual level, it's more so the top-down aspect of it. The Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and the Russian Federation are very oppressive regimes. Each and every one of them was known for its oppression and its control over the people who lived within it. And these were also not particularly wealthy places. Even to this day, there is quite a bit of economic hardship within the Russian Federation. And while things have definitely been getting better within the Russian Federation over the past 20, 30 years especially, but even in the last, say, 5 to 10, things are getting more stable. Things are kind of getting better in a lot of ways for the average Russian, outside of a lot of the sanctions that have been put on by outside powers, most notably the United States. Things are kind of getting better, and people are making a little bit more money, and they are finding a little bit better lives for themselves. But it is still very much so not popular amongst certain groups anyways to stay within Russia. A lot of people within the Russian Federation don't want to be there. They see economic opportunity as something in Western Europe, as something in somewhere else. And they also see safety and freedom and other things outside of the Russian Federation. And so, on the one hand, dealing with all of this, dealing with the oppressive Russian government, dealing with a long history of oppression, dealing with a long history of, and then now a new current war, and then dealing with the economic hardship that comes with all of this, and then also with the just rank corruption that the Russian government is known for, it creates a perfect environment for people who are not happy and who turn to alcohol. As well, there is a lot of desire to leave, and a lot of people can't leave. When I was in Russia, this is something I heard time and time again. A number of people that I talked to said, I want to get out of here. The number one thing that people asked me when I came to Russia is, why are you here? And I said, well, I'm interested in the culture and I'm interested in the art and the history and blah, blah, blah. And they said, well, why don't you go be interested in Germany? Like, they were genuinely interested and kind of concerned. Why did you come to this place? Everyone around you is trying to leave, and here you come. Now, I am not going to simplify everything to say that literally every Russian is clamoring to leave the country, but a number of them don't want to be there. And, well, a lot of them feel trapped. I couldn't tell you exactly how many. Of course, my experience there is just my own, and maybe if you talk to different people, you find a completely different opposite experience. But I do know that among the people that I went with, this was not an uncommon topic for discussion. Particularly among younger people, there is a desire to leave the Russian Federation, to go somewhere else, to go somewhere where they feel like they can be more free, where they can make more money, where things can be a little bit better. And so for the folks who can't, for the folks who are, say, older, or the folks who can't afford, or for whatever reason are stuck or feel stuck within the Russian Federation, alcohol, that becomes an escape. It is a very big tool to escape the kind of unpleasantries of the Russian society, of the Russian government, and how it crushes these people into dust. So, yeah, I know, a bit of a bummer again to end this on, but this is the reality of it. It is a very big, unfortunate shame, but I think it is important to understand because we do, and I do, make a lot of jokes about Russia and alcohol. Russians do. It is a topic that Russians discuss a lot, and it is a topic that they joke about. And like I said before, I don't think that necessarily we need to go, okay, no, alcohol is taboo and we can't discuss it because it's too dark, it's too bleak, whatever. No. I think it's fine to talk about it. I think it's even fine to joke about in a certain light. But we do need to recognize that this is a very serious issue for who knows how many people. Hundreds of thousands, maybe millions. I mean, I think you could make a pretty good argument that this affects basically everyone in the Russian Federation. That basically everyone there is being affected by this, at least a little bit. Maybe not as, people who are drinking alcohol, but people know people who've been hurt by this. People live in a society where this continues to hurt people, where it continues to put stress on themselves, on their systems, on the people who need to take care of these people, like, say, doctors or paramedics or whatever. As well, it's not just within Russia where you see this. This kind of alcohol abuse is very common in the entire post-Soviet world. And I know a lot of people might want to go, well, of course it is. Those are just those people. They're Slavs, or they're Central Asians, or they're Caucasians, or they're whatever, and they just do that. No, that's not true. There is certainly a history of alcohol within these groups, but there's a history of alcohol in basically every group. You go to literally any corner of this whole goddamn planet, and you're going to find people who abuse alcohol. And you're going to find a whole culture around. You're going to find a whole culture built up around it. I mean, go to any high school in the United States of America, and you will find something that looks eerily similar to any kind of alcoholic abuse that you would see in Russia or Poland or Latvia, Lithuania, any post-Soviet state, whatever. So I think we just need to kind of put that in our minds the next time we want to think about Russia and vodka in kind of the same sentence or kind of in the same breath. That while, yes, absolutely, that is true, there is also a very real human aspect to this that not just deserves, but really kind of needs to be thought about and needs to be discussed. So I hope that that's what I did here today. I hope that this long, rambling kind of diatribe that I've put together kind of gets to the point of that. If not, well, please let me know. Any feelings, thoughts, opinions, things you want to see new, different, or kept the same. I would love to hear it because I'm always trying to expand this podcast. I'm always trying to make it better. And of course, interaction does help grow the show. So as we wrap up, as always, I hope you guys enjoyed the show. I hope you guys found it interesting. I hope you learned something. And if not, go read a book. What can I do? But for real though, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun putting this together, and I have a lot of fun making all of these episodes. I really have been enjoying creating this podcast, and I hope you guys are enjoying it too. I've been getting some really good feedback on what people like, on what people don't like, and I've been getting a lot of positive reviews, which of course make me feel very good and warm inside. So let's keep those going, please. But I digress. Thank you again for listening. I hope you all are having a wonderful day, and I'll catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.